The diary was still warm from the sun when Walter Keating pulled it from beneath the floorboards of the hay loft, and by the time he finished reading the third page, his hands were shaking so hard he nearly dropped the lantern into the straw. 12 years he had carried the question of what happened to his family on the night of the fire, and now, in a stranger's cramped handwriting, the answer was staring up at him from a water-stained page in a barn that did not belong to him, on land he had only come to work because he needed the wages. It was the spring of 1886, and Walter had ridden into Cedar Hollow, Wyoming Territory, 3 days earlier with little more than a bedroll, a Winchester rifle, $40 in his saddlebag, and a grief that had never once loosened its grip on his chest. He was 29 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of cattle work, with a face that had been handsome once and was now weathered into something harder, something that looked older than his years. He had been a boy of 17 when the fire took his mother, his father, and his little sister Lucy, who had been only 8 and had loved to chase fireflies along the creek behind their homestead. The sheriff back then had called it a chimney fire, an accident, a tragedy of the kind that happened too often on the frontier where wood was dry and wind was constant. Walter had never believed it. He had ridden away from that scorched patch of Wyoming ground with nothing but the clothes on his back and a hole in him that no amount of drifting, no amount of cattle drives from Texas to Montana, no amount of whiskey in 100 different saloons had ever managed to fill. He had come to Cedar Hollow because a man in Cheyenne had told him there was ranch work to be had, and because, if he was honest with himself, Cedar Hollow was only 20 miles from where his family's homestead had once stood, and something in him could never stay away for long. He had answered a notice pinned to the wall of the mercantile, a notice written in a careful, looping hand that read simply, "Ranch hand wanted. Fair wages. Ask for Ellen Baker at the Baker place, north of town along Willow Creek." He had not expected the Baker place to be run by a woman alone, and he had not expected that woman to be Ellen Baker, 26 years old, with hair the color of ripe wheat pulled back beneath a faded blue bonnet, and eyes the gray-green of sage after rain. She had met him at the gate with a shotgun resting easy in the crook of her arm, not pointed at him, but close enough that he understood she knew how to use it. "You're the one who answered the notice," she had said. It was not quite a question. "Walter Keating, ma'am. I can ride, rope, mend fence, and I don't drink on the job." She had looked him over the way a person looks over a horse they are thinking of buying, not unkindly, but thoroughly. "We will see about that, Mr. Keating. I pay $18 a month and board. You will sleep in the bunkhouse, not the barn, and you will not touch a thing in that barn's loft. It is full of my father's belongings, and I have not had the heart to sort through it yet." He had agreed, of course, because $18 a month was fair money, and because there was something about the set of her jaw, the steadiness in her voice even as sorrow moved behind her eyes when she mentioned her father, that made him want to know more about her, though he told himself at the time it was only curiosity, the kind any decent man might feel toward a young woman running a ranch alone in hard country. For 2 weeks he worked the Baker ranch honestly, mending fence along the creek, breaking a stubborn gray gelding, helping Ellen drive her small herd of 30 head to better grazing when the near pasture went dry. He learned in pieces, the way a person learns anything true about another person on the frontier, through long silences and short sentences offered over supper. Ellen's mother had died of a fever when Ellen was 22. Her father, Thomas Baker, had passed 3 years back, in the winter of 1883, from an injury that never healed right after a fall from a wagon, though Ellen said this last part with a hesitation that made Walter wonder if there was more to it. She had no brothers, no sisters, only the ranch and a hired girl named Sarah who came twice a week to help with washing, and lately, a persistent suitor in Jeb Cormack, son of the largest cattle baron in 3 counties, who rode out from his father's spread every Sunday whether Ellen wanted him to or not. "He means to have this land. Ellen told Walter one evening as they sat on the porch steps shelling peas into a tin bowl, the sun sinking gold and heavy behind the western ridge. His father has wanted the water rights on Willow Creek for 15 years. Jeb thinks marrying me is a gentler way of taking them than his father's other methods. What other methods would those be? Walter asked, and something in his voice must have carried an edge because Ellen looked at him sideways. You have heard of Silas Cormac, then? Everyone from here to Cheyenne has heard of Silas Cormac. Walter kept his eyes on the peas in his hands, though his jaw had gone tight. Man's got half the territory believing he built this valley up from nothing through hard work and good fortune. And you don't believe that? I don't know the man, Walter said, which was true enough, though it was not the whole truth, because the name Cormac had lodged itself in Walter's memory 12 years ago, back when his father had argued with a Cormac foreman over water rights on their own small parcel of land, only weeks before the fire took everything. Walter had never been able to prove a connection. He had been 17 and grieving and alone, and no lawman in the territory had wanted to hear a boy's suspicions about a man as powerful as Silas Cormac. He had buried the thought along with his family, or told himself he had, though it rose up in him now like water finding a crack in stone. It was 3 nights later that the storm came through, a hard spring rain that turned the yard to mud and set the barn's old roof to leaking in a dozen places. Ellen had asked Walter to move some of her father's stored belongings away from a leak near the loft's east corner, trunks and old harness, and a rolled canvas tent that had not been used in years. It was while dragging one particular trunk toward the drier side of the loft that its latch, rusted and weak, gave way, spilling its contents across the straw. Among the folded shirts and a cracked leather Bible and a tintype photograph of a stern-faced woman Walter did not recognize, there was a small book bound in brown leather, its pages swollen with old moisture and time. A diary, the kind many men and women kept on the frontier to record weather and wages and the small facts of survival. He should not have opened it. He knew that even as his fingers found the cover and turned it back. But something about the year written inside the front cover in faded ink, 1874, caught at him the way a hand catches at a sleeve, and he could not stop himself from reading. The early entries were mundane, notes on cattle counts and the price of feed and a description of a foreman's temper. But as Walter turned the pages by lantern light, his heart beginning to pound before his mind had even caught up to why, the entries grew darker, more halting, the handwriting less steady. Mr. Cormac has asked of me a thing I do not wish to do, the entry read. He says the Keating family will not sell the spring land no matter what price he offers, and that a fire in their barn, set while they sleep, timed for the wind to carry smoke but not flame to the house, will frighten them into leaving before summer. He says no one will be hurt. He says it is only smoke and fear, and that I owe him for the debt on my own land, and that if I do not do this thing he will see me and my wife and my little Ellen put off our place before the year is through. Walter's breath had stopped somewhere in his chest. He read on, though every word felt like a hot coal pressed against his ribs. I have done it. God forgive me, I have done it, and the wind turned. I did not mean for the fire to reach the house. I swear before Almighty God I did not mean it. I heard the screaming and I could not move. I could not go to them. I was too much a coward, and by the time I found my legs the roof had already gone. There was a boy, I am told, away in town buying feed, who came back to find his family gone and his home a smoking ruin, and I am the reason for it, and I will carry this the rest of my days and never speak it to a living soul. For if Cormac does not kill me for confessing, the noose surely would. And then what would become of my wife, of my Ellen, only 4 years old and knowing nothing of what her father has done? I write this only so that someday, if God is merciful enough to demand it of me before I die, the truth might be known. I am sorry. I am sorry. There are no words sufficient. I am sorry. Walter did not remember dropping the lantern. only that it fell and sputtered against the wet straw, and he had to stamp it out with his boot before it caught. The irony of it striking him, even through the roaring in his ears, that he had very nearly set another fire while reading the confession of the one who had set the first. He sat there a long while in the dark, the rain hammering the roof above him, the diary open in his lap, and he wept the way he had not wept since he was 17 years old, kneeling in the ashes of his mother's kitchen, great tearing sobs that came up out of some buried place he had thought long sealed over. Thomas Baker, Ellen's father. The man Ellen spoke of with such tender, uncomplicated grief. The man who had, by his own hand and his own confession, burned Walter's family to death. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the bunkhouse with the diary hidden inside his shirt, against his skin, as though it might burn through him too, and he turned over in his mind every manner of leaving before morning, riding out before the sun rose and never looking back, taking the diary as proof to some marshal in Cheyenne, and letting the law sort out what remained of Cormac's guilt without ever having to look Ellen Baker in the eye again. But something in him, some stubborn, wounded thing, would not let him go without speaking the truth aloud to her first. He told himself it was justice. He suspected, even then, that it was something closer to needing to see whether the woman he had begun, against every good sense he possessed to care for, was capable of the same cowardice as her father, or whether she was made of something else entirely. He found her at dawn in the kitchen, already awake, already at the stove, her hair loose and unbrushed, dark circles beneath her eyes from a night of listening to the storm worry at the roof. She looked up when he came in, and whatever she saw on his face made her set down the coffee pot at once. "Walter, what has happened?" He could not speak at first. He only held out the diary, open to the page, his hand trembling so that the pages fluttered like a wounded bird. She took it from him, frowning, and began to read, and he watched the color drain from her face by degrees, watched her lips part, watched her hand come up to cover her mouth as she reached the words Ellen, only 4 years old. "No," she whispered. "No, this cannot be. My father was a gentle man. He never raised his voice to me in 26 years. He wept at the death of a hired dog once, Walter, he could not have." "He wrote it in his own hand," Walter said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, rough with old grief given new fuel. "That's my family, Ellen, Robert and Margaret Keating, my sister Lucy. She was 8 years old. She used to chase fireflies down by our creek, and I used to tell her she'd never catch one because they were faster than her, and she'd laugh and try anyway every single summer night. And your father burned her alive in her bed because Silas Cormac wanted a spring for his cattle." Ellen's knees seemed to give slightly, and she caught herself against the table edge, the diary still open in her white-knuckled hand. "I did not know," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "Walter, I swear before God I did not know. I never went through his things. I could not bear to. I thought he died an honest man, a hard-working, honest man, and now you are telling me he—" She could not finish the sentence. She sat down heavily in the kitchen chair, the diary sliding from her fingers onto the table, and she put her face in her hands and wept. And Walter, standing there with 12 years of grief boiling in his chest and no clear place to put it, found that he could not simply walk away from her sorrow, however much a part of him wanted to blame her for sins that were never hers to carry. "I am not," he said slowly, forcing the words out past the anger still lodged in his throat. "I am not saying it was you. I know it was not you. You were 4 years old. But it was my father. It was his hand that struck the match. Whatever debt is owed for that, it does not simply vanish because I did not know of it." She lifted her tear-streaked face to look at him, and there was something fierce beneath the grief, something that reminded him oddly of the shotgun she had carried the first day he met her. "What do you intend to do, Walter Keating? Ride to the marshal and see my father's memory hanged in the newspapers, though he is 3 years in his grave and cannot answer for himself? Or do you mean something else?" He did not have an answer for her, not that morning, and he told her so honestly. He needed time, he said, time to think, time to decide what a man was owed when the debt could no longer be collected from the one who incurred it, only from the memory of him, and from the daughter who bore his name. He walked out to the pasture and did not come back until well after dark, and Ellen did not ask him where he had gone, though her eyes were red-rimmed still when she set his supper on the table that night, and neither of them spoke more than a handful of words. It was 2 days later, while Walter was mending a stretch of fence along the northern boundary of the Baker land, that Jeb Cormack rode up on a fine black gelding, dressed in a coat too fine for ranch country, his mustache waxed and his manner easy in the way of a man who has never once doubted that the world will bend to his wishes. "You're the new hand," Jeb said, looking Walter over the way Ellen had, though with considerably less warmth. "Keating, is it? Funny name." There was a Keating family used to have a place out past Sweetwater Ridge, before my father bought that ground off the county after they died. Fire, wasn't it? Terrible thing. Walter's hands went still on the fence wire. "That's right," he said carefully. "Terrible thing. My father's got half a mind to run cattle clean through that valley next season, now that the water's finally his to use as he pleases. Man's worked hard for that water, Keating. 15 years of patient dealing." Jeb smiled, showing white teeth beneath the waxed mustache. "You tell Miss Baker I'll be by Sunday as usual. Tell her my father's asking after her mother's old recipe for the peach preserves. Says he remembers them fondly from years back, when old Thomas Baker still worked for him." Walter kept his voice even through an effort that cost him more than any day of branding cattle in July heat. "I'll tell her." He did tell her that evening, and watched Ellen's face go pale and still at the mention of the peach preserves, at the casual reminder that Silas Cormack had once employed her father, that the Cormacks had bought the Keating land itself off the county after the fire, likely for a fraction of its worth, likely through channels greased by gilt money or simple opportunism. It was, Walter thought, watching her, as though every new fact confirmed what the diary had already told them, laying one more stone atop a foundation of old cruelty that had somehow never been questioned by anyone with the power to question it. "We have to go to the marshal," Ellen said finally, setting down her fork, her supper untouched. "Whatever it costs my father's memory, whatever it costs me, Walter, we cannot simply know this and do nothing. Your family deserves better than my silence." "It's not only your silence that would need breaking," Walter said. "Silas Cormack has half the territory in his pocket, judges, marshals, half the cattlemen's association. A diary written by a dead man is not proof enough to hang a living one, not when that living one owns the bank that holds half this county's mortgages." "Then, what do you propose?" Walter was quiet a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly between his palms. "I propose we find out if there's anyone else still living who knows the truth of what happened that night. Someone who worked for Cormack back then. Someone who might have seen more than your father wrote down, or who might be willing to speak now that Cormack's grown old and careless, the way powerful men sometimes do." It was Ellen who remembered, 2 days later, the name of an old foreman named Amos Whitfield who had worked the Cormack spread for 30 years, before retiring to a small cabin near the edge of town, a man her father had mentioned once or twice in passing, always with a kind of wary respect. Walter rode out to find him on a gray Tuesday morning, the sky low and heavy with the threat of more rain, and found the old man sitting on his porch mending a bridle, his hands gnarled with age but still nimble at the work. "You'll be the Keating boy," Amos said before Walter had even dismounted, and something in the way he said it without surprise told Walter that the old man had been expecting this conversation for a long time, perhaps longer than Walter himself had been alive to have it. "You knew my father," Walter said. "I knew your father, and I knew Thomas Baker, and I knew what Silas Cormack ordered done that spring of 1874, though I have carried it quiet all these years the same as Thomas did, out of the same cowardice, I expect, since I had a wife and children depending on my wages same as he did." Amos set down the bridle and looked at Walter with old, tired eyes. "I am 71 years old, son, and I have buried a wife and outlived 2 of my own children to fever, and I find I have grown weary of carrying secrets to my grave the way it seems half this territory intends to do. I will tell you what I know, and I will tell it to a marshal too, if you can get one out here who is not bought and paid for by Silas Cormac's money." What Amos told them, over the course of that long gray morning, filled in the gaps that Thomas Baker's diary had left open. Amos had been present when Cormac gave the order, had heard him say plainly that the Keating family's refusal to sell their spring water had cost him 2 seasons of grazing rights, and he intended to see them gone from that land one way or another. Amos had not lit the fire, but he had known it was coming, had done nothing to stop it, and had helped in the weeks after to falsify the report given to the county sheriff, a report that called the fire an accident, a chimney spark, nothing more. He had kept a copy of that false report, tucked away with his other papers, more out of guilt than foresight, though he said now that guilt might finally serve some purpose. Cormac paid the sheriff of that time a sum of money to close the matter quickly, Amos said. Sheriff's long dead now, drank himself into an early grave some years back, God rest him, though I do not know that he deserves resting easy. But there is a marshal out of Cheyenne, name of Nathaniel Pierce, who came through here 2 summers back investigating cattle theft, and struck me as an honest man, the sort who does not care whose toes he steps on so long as the law is served. If you can bring him back to Cedar Hollow, I will tell him what I know, and I will hand over that old false report besides. It took Walter and Ellen the better part of 2 weeks to send word to Marshal Pierce and arrange his return to Cedar Hollow, weeks during which Silas Cormac, whether by simple coincidence or by some warning carried to him through the gossip that moves faster than any rider across open country, grew increasingly bold in his pressure on Ellen's ranch. Jeb Cormac's Sunday visits turned from courtship into something closer to demand. His father's name invoked more often veiled talk of what might happen to a woman alone on a ranch if her fences were to mysteriously fail during calving season, if her water rights were to be challenged in court by lawyers her small operation could never hope to match. Ellen bore it with a straight back and a steady voice, but Walter saw the toll it took on her in the small hours, saw her at the kitchen window some nights staring out at the dark pasture, as though she expected trouble to come walking up out of it. It was during those weeks of waiting that Walter and Ellen grew close in a way that neither of them had entirely intended, nor could easily stop once it had begun. Grief and danger have a way of stripping away the careful distances people keep between themselves, and Walter found that the woman whose father had, by cruel accident of history, been the instrument of his family's destruction, was also the gentlest, most steadfast person he had ever known. She sat with him one evening on the porch steps, long after the ranch chores were done, and asked him quietly to tell her about Lucy. "She had my mother's laugh," Walter said, surprised at how easily the words came, after 12 years of never speaking his sister's name aloud to another living soul. "Too loud for a room," my father used to say, though he never meant it unkindly. She wanted a pony more than anything in the world, and I had promised her that when I came back from town that day, I would ask father again because her birthday was only 2 weeks off. He stopped, his throat tight. I never got to ask him. I never got to tell her yes. Ellen did not offer empty comfort. She only reached over and took his hand in both of hers, her palms rough with ranch work, warm despite the cool evening air, and held it until his breathing steadied. And then she said, simply, "I am so sorry, Walter. I am sorry for what my father did, and I am sorry that Lucy never got her pony, and I am sorry that you have carried this alone for 12 years when you should never have had to carry it at all." She did not let go of his hand for a long while after that, and Walter, looking at her in the fading light, understood that whatever anger he had carried toward the name Baker had transformed itself, slowly and against every expectation he had walked into Cedar Hollow with, into something that felt very much like love. It was not a comfortable love, not at first. There were nights Walter lay awake in the bunkhouse turning over the unfairness of it, that the woman he found himself wanting to spend his life beside was the daughter of the man who had killed his family, however unwittingly, however coerced. He spoke of this once to Amos Whitfield, riding out to the old foreman's cabin on some pretext of checking on him before the marshal arrived, and Amos, who had buried 2 children and a wife and had grown philosophical in his old age, told him something that stayed with him. "Son, the world is not so simple as villains and innocents standing in separate rooms. Thomas Baker was a coward and he did a terrible wrong, and he paid for it every day of his remaining life. I promise you that. I saw the man age 10 years in the space of 1 season. But his daughter is not her father, any more than you are only your grief. You cannot spend your whole life waiting for the world to hand you a clean and simple justice, because it will not come, not in this territory, not in any territory I have ever known. What you can do is choose, each day, whether you will let old wrongs poison the good that is standing right in front of you." He had looked at Walter with something like sympathy then. "I have watched you 2 together, boy. I am old, not blind. Do not throw away a good woman's love chasing a ghost that cannot love you back." Marshal Nathaniel Pierce arrived in Cedar Hollow on a warm afternoon in early June, a tall, quiet man with a graying mustache and eyes that missed very little. He listened to Amos Whitfield's testimony in the small front room of Amos's cabin, examined the false report the old foreman produced from a tin box hidden beneath his floorboards, and read Thomas Baker's diary twice through without comment, though his jaw tightened visibly at certain passages. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and looked between Walter, Ellen, and Amos with the weary expression of a man who has seen enough of the territory's hidden cruelties to no longer be surprised by them, only wearied. "This is enough to bring charges," he said finally. "Arson resulting in death is a hanging offense in this territory, even after 12 years, and there is no statute that shields a man from murder simply because he has grown rich and respectable in the meantime. But I will tell you plainly, Silas Cormac has friends in the territorial government, and he will not go quietly. I intend to ride out to his ranch tomorrow morning with 2 deputies and take him into custody before he has any warning to run or to buy his way clear. I would ask that you both stay well clear of it for your own safety." Walter had every intention of staying clear, or told himself he did, but fate, or perhaps simple ill luck, decided otherwise. Word reached Silas Cormac that very night, carried perhaps by some hand in town loyal to his money, that a marshal had arrived asking questions about an old fire and an old diary, and Cormac, who had built an empire on ruthlessness and did not intend to see it dismantled by the confession of a dead hired man, chose to act before the marshal could reach him. It was well past midnight when Walter woke to the smell of smoke. He was on his feet and out of the bunkhouse before he had fully understood what his senses were telling him, and what he saw in the yard drove every other thought from his mind. The Baker barn, the very barn where he had found the diary weeks before, was burning, orange light licking up along the old dry timbers with terrible speed, and worse, far worse, he could see 2 riders wheeling their horses away from the house itself, where flame was already crawling up the porch rail toward the kitchen window, toward the room where Ellen slept. Ellen. His voice tore out of him raw and desperate, 12 years of buried terror surfacing all at once. The memory of another fire, another house, another family he had failed to save because he had not been there in time. He ran for the house at a dead sprint, kicked the front door open, and found the front room already filling with smoke, the fire having caught somewhere beneath the kitchen floor, likely from coal oil poured and lit at the foundation, a deliberate and practiced hand at work. Ellen. He found her in the hallway, coughing, disoriented from smoke, in her nightdress with a shawl clutched around her shoulders, having woken to the smell too late to think clearly. He caught her around the waist and half-carried, half-dragged her out through the front door and across the yard to where the night air was clean, setting her down hard on the grass a safe distance from the burning house. And then, before she could catch her breath enough to stop him, he turned and ran back toward the barn where he could hear, over the roar of flame, the terrified screaming of the horses trapped inside. "Walter, no!" Ellen's voice cracked behind him, but he did not stop. He could not, stand by and watch another set of living creatures burn while he did nothing. Not again. Not ever again as long as he drew breath. He wrenched open the barn door, smoke pouring out to meet him, and worked his way down the row of stalls in a half-crouch, choking, his eyes streaming, unlatching each stall and driving the panicked horses out toward the open door and the night sky beyond, one after another, until only Ellen's gray gelding remained, rearing and screaming in the farthest stall, a fallen beam having pinned part of the stall door. Walter did not remember afterward exactly how he freed the animal, only that his hands were burned along the left forearm by the time he stumbled back out into the yard, with the gelding thundering past him to freedom, and that his lungs felt as though they had been scoured with sand, and that Ellen was there, sobbing, pulling him away from the collapsing barn and down onto the grass. Her hands running over him, checking for injury with a franticness that would have been almost comic in gentler circumstances. "You fool man," she was saying, half laughing, half weeping, pressing her forehead against his smoke-blackened shirt. "You absolute fool, you could have died in there, you could have burned same as your own family, and I would never have forgiven myself, never. I could not let it happen again," Walter said, his voice a broken rasp. "I could not stand there and let something burn while I did nothing. Not again. Not ever again." They sat together in the wreckage-lit dark, the barn a smoking ruin, the house's kitchen wing scorched but saved by a bucket brigade that Amos Whitfield, roused by the glow visible even from his distant cabin, arrived to help organize alongside two neighboring ranch hands. It was Amos who found, in the trampled mud near the road, the clear print of a fine-shod horse, the kind bred and shod on wealthy ranches, not the rough stock of ordinary homesteaders. And it was this print, along with a half-empty coal oil can dropped in haste near the barn's foundation, that Marshal Pierce used the following morning as further evidence when he rode, with his two deputies, and a warrant freshly sworn before the territorial judge in Cheyenne, out to the Cormack Ranch to place Silas Cormack under arrest. Silas Cormack did not go quietly, exactly as the marshal had predicted. He met the lawman on his own porch with a rifle in hand and his son Jeb beside him, and for a long, terrible quarter-hour, word later carried back to Cedar Hollow, there had been shouting, threats, the cocking of weapons before Cormack's own ranch hands, men who had grown weary over the years of the old man's cruelty and had no wish to die defending him, quietly set down their own arms and refused to take his side. Faced with no support even among his own men, Cormack finally surrendered his rifle, cursing the marshal, cursing Amos Whitfield by name, cursing the memory of a diary written by a dead man 12 years past that had finally, after all his careful years of buying silence, come back to collect its due. Jeb Cormack, for his part, swore he had known nothing of his father's order to burn the Baker barn, and evidence later suggested this was likely true, though it did not save him from the shame of his father's arrest, nor from the quiet, final understanding between himself and Ellen that whatever courtship he had pursued was well and truly over. He rode out of Cedar Hollow within the month, taking up work on a ranch near Laramie, and no one in town heard much of him again beyond occasional mention in passing. The trial, when it came in late summer, was a spectacle the likes of which Cedar Hollow had never seen. Reporters traveling up from Cheyenne, curious townsfolk packing the small courthouse to hear testimony from Amos Whitfield, from Marshal Pierce, and from Walter Keating himself, who stood before the judge and spoke, for the first time in 12 years, The full account of the night he had come home to find his family dead and his home a smoking ruin. Ellen sat in the front row throughout, her hands folded tight in her lap, and when the judge finally pronounced Silas Cormac guilty of arson resulting in death, sentencing him to hang the following month, she reached over and took Walter's hand the moment he stepped down from the witness stand, and neither of them let go for the rest of that long, exhausting day. There was, too, a quieter reckoning that summer, one that mattered perhaps even more to Walter than the courtroom's verdict. He rode out, alone, to the small county cemetery where Thomas Baker was buried beside his wife, and stood a long while before the modest wooden marker, turning over in his mind everything he had learned in the months since finding that diary in the barn loft. He did not forgive easily, and he told himself he was not there to forgive, not entirely. But he found, standing in the tall summer grass with the wind moving through it the same as it had moved through the grass above his own family's graves, that he no longer wished to carry hatred for a man who had, in the end, been as much a victim of Silas Cormac's cruelty as Walter's own family. A coward, certainly, a man who had done a terrible wrong, but a man who had also spent every remaining day of his life in private torment over it, who had raised a daughter of extraordinary goodness despite his own failings, and who had, in writing down the truth even knowing he might never have courage enough to speak it aloud, left behind the very thing that finally brought justice to bear. "I don't know if you can hear me," Walter said aloud to the quiet grave, feeling foolish and yet unable to stop himself. "But I loved my sister more than anything in this world, and I hated you for a long while, hated you the way I expect a man is allowed to hate the thing that took his family from him. I don't know that I've stopped hating what you did. But your daughter is the finest person I have ever known, and I think, wherever you are, you know that too, and maybe that is some comfort to you, if the dead are given any comfort at all. I am going to marry her if she will have me. I wanted you to know that first, before I asked her." He rode back to the Baker ranch that evening with something loosened in his chest that had been clenched tight for 12 long years, and found Ellen in the garden behind the rebuilt kitchen wing, kneeling in the dirt among a row of new-planted beans, her sleeves rolled up and dirt smudged across one cheek, and he thought, watching her, that he had never in his life seen anything so beautiful as this ordinary woman doing ordinary work in the golden light of a Wyoming evening. "You went to the cemetery," Ellen said, not looking up, though something in her voice told him she had been waiting, perhaps all day, to hear how it had gone. "I did, and I think I am done being angry at a dead man, Ellen. I don't know that I've forgiven him, not entirely, not yet, but I don't want to carry it the way I've carried it for 12 years. I don't want it standing between us anymore." She sat back on her heels then and looked up at him, and there were tears standing in her eyes, though her mouth had curved into something like a smile. "I have been so afraid," she said, "that you would look at me every day for the rest of your life and see my father's face instead of mine, that you would never be able to separate the two of us in your heart." Walter knelt down in the dirt beside her, careless of his good trousers, and took her dirt-smudged face gently between his hands. "Ellen Baker," he said, "I have known you 3 months, and in that time I have watched you run a ranch alone with more courage than most men twice your size, hold a shotgun steady on a stranger at your gate without so much as a tremor in your hand, weep over a diary that broke your heart, and still stand up the very next morning to do your chores because the cattle did not care about your grief, and pull a fool of a man out of a burning barn with your bare hands practically. Though I know you'd have gone in after me if I hadn't come out on my own. I do not see your father when I look at you. I have never once seen your father when I look at you. I see the bravest, kindest, most stubborn woman I have ever had the good fortune to meet, and I find that I cannot imagine spending what remains of my life anywhere that you are not. Walter," her voice broke on his name, "I am asking you to marry me, Ellen. I know it is fast, and I know the world we come from is not one that waits gently for two hearts to be certain of themselves, And I know there will be people in this town who whisper about it for a year or two, about the Keating boy marrying Thomas Baker's daughter. Let them whisper. I have spent 12 years letting other people's silence and other people's secrets decide the shape of my life. I would like, for the rest of my days, to decide it myself, and I would like to decide it with you standing beside me. Ellen laughed, a wet, startled sound, half sob and half joy, and threw her arms around his neck so suddenly that he nearly toppled backward into the bean rows. "Yes," she said against his shoulder. "Yes, Walter Keating. 1,000 times yes. Though I warn you now, I intend to hold you to shelling peas on the porch every single evening for the rest of our lives, exactly as we did the first week you came to work here, because I have never in my life felt so at peace as I did those evenings, before either of us knew what we would come to mean to each other." They were married that October, in the small white church at the center of Cedar Hollow, with Amos Whitfield giving away the bride in place of the father she no longer had, and Marshall Pierce, who had returned to Cedar Hollow specially for the occasion, standing witness alongside half the town, all of whom had, by then, come to see the marriage not as some scandal-joining victim and villain's daughter, but as the closing of an old wound the whole county had carried, whether they knew it or not. Since that terrible fire 12 years before, Walter used what remained of his savings. Together with money Ellen had carefully put by from her ranch's modest profits, to purchase back the old Keating homestead land from the county, land that had passed, after Cormac's conviction, and the seizing of his estate to pay restitution to the families he had wronged over the years, into public sale at auction. It was overgrown now, the old house long since collapsed and cleared away, but the spring still ran clear and cold at the base of the ridge, the same spring that had cost his family their lives 12 years before, and Walter stood beside that spring on the day the papers were signed, Ellen's hand in his, and felt, for the first time since he was 17 years old, that the ground beneath his feet was truly his own again, not haunted, not cursed, simply home. They built a new house on that land the following spring, timber hauled up from the mill in Cedar Hollow, the framing raised over 3 long days with the help of half the county. For in the way of frontier communities, once a wrong has been set right, neighbors are often eager to help lay a new foundation, as though the whole town wished to have some hand in the healing. Ellen planted a garden in the same spot, she said, where she imagined Margaret Keating might once have kept her own, and though Walter had no way of knowing if the placement was accurate, he found the gesture moved him more than he could easily say. They combined the 2 ranches, the old Baker place and the newly reclaimed Keating land, into a single growing operation that within 3 years had become one of the most respected small cattle outfits in the county, built not on the ruthless expansion that had driven Silas Cormac, but on fair dealing, honest wages, and the kind of careful, patient stewardship that both Walter and Ellen had learned, in their different ways, mattered more in the long run than sheer size. Amos Whitfield came to live out his final years in a small cabin on their land, at their invitation, for neither of them could bear the thought of the old man living out his days alone after all he had done to help see justice served, and he taught their eventual children, when they came, how to mend a bridle and read the weather in the shape of clouds along the western ridge, skills he had spent a lifetime learning and seemed grateful in his last years to have someone left to pass them on to. Their first child was a son, born in the summer of 1888, whom they named Thomas, not for Ellen's father in memory of his sins, but for the name itself, which Ellen said she wished to reclaim from the shadow it had lived under, to give it a new meaning in a boy who would grow up loved and free of any burden of the past. Walter had hesitated at first, the old grief flaring briefly at the suggestion, but watching Ellen hold their newborn son in the lamplight, exhausted and radiant, he found he could not deny her this one small mercy, this one act of reclaiming, and by the time young Thomas Keating was old enough to run barefoot through the summer grass down by the spring, laughing the way children do, without any weight of history pressing on his small shoulders. Walter found he had come to love the name entirely on its own terms, separate at last from everything it had once meant to him. Their second child, born 2 years later, was a daughter, whom they named Lucy after Walter's sister, and it was Ellen who suggested it this time, understanding without needing to be told how much it would mean to Walter to hear that name spoken again in his own home, in his own life, attached now to a living, laughing child rather than only to grief. Little Lucy Keating grew up chasing fireflies down by the very same creek her aunt once had, 12 years and a lifetime removed from the tragedy that had taken the first Lucy from the world. And on summer evenings, watching his small daughter dart barefoot through the tall grass with a jar clutched in her hands, Walter would sometimes feel his throat tighten with an emotion too large and too complicated for simple words, part grief still, always some part grief, but mostly, by then, something closer to gratitude. That life had somehow found a way to give him this, to give him back a version of the joy that had once been stolen from him. Amos Whitfield lived to see both children grow past their toddling years before he passed peacefully in his sleep one winter night in 1892, and Walter and Ellen buried him with full honors in the same small cemetery where Thomas Baker lay, at the old man's own request, for he said before he died that he wished to lie near the man whose confession, however long delayed, had finally allowed an old wrong to be righted, and that he had made his peace with Thomas Baker's memory long before. Understanding better than most the particular weight of a coward's guilt, carried silently across long years. Silas Cormac was hanged in Cheyenne in September of 1886, and neither Walter nor Ellen attended, having decided together that whatever justice required, they did not require the sight of a man's death to feel it complete. It was enough, Ellen said, that the truth had finally been spoken aloud in a courtroom, that Walter's family's names had finally been cleared of the false accident report that had denied them even the dignity of an honest death, and that the Walter Cormac had killed to possess now ran free again through land that no longer belonged to cruelty. In the years that followed, the story of the diary found in the hayloft, of the marshal who rode out to arrest a powerful rancher, of the young cowboy and the rancher's daughter who fell in love across the wreckage of an old tragedy, became something of a local legend in Cedar Hollow, told and retold at church socials and barn dances, growing, as such stories do, a little larger and a little more dramatic with each telling, though Walter and Ellen themselves rarely spoke of it beyond what their children needed to know, which was, in the end, only this, that their father and mother had found each other through great sorrow, that the world had once dealt them both a terrible hand, and that they had chosen together to build something good and lasting out of the wreckage, because that, in the end, was the only true answer either of them had ever found to the question of what a person owes to grief, and to love, and to the long, patient work of forgiveness. On quiet evenings, when the chores were done and the children were asleep, Walter and Ellen still sat together on the porch of the house they had built with their own hands, shelling peas into the same tin bowl Ellen had used the very first week Walter came to work for her, watching the sun go down gold and heavy behind the western ridge, the spring running clear and cold at the base of the hill below, and neither of them ever tired of the simple, hard-won piece of it. The particular sweetness of a life built not on the absence of tragedy, for neither of them had been spared that, but on the stubborn, faithful choice to love one another fully in spite of it, and because of it, and through every difficult year that followed. It was Ellen who liked to say, on the anniversary of their wedding each October, that she believed some loves were forged rather than found, hammered into their true shape by fire the same way iron is hammered into a plow or a horseshoe, useful and strong precisely because of what they had been made to withstand. Walter never had a poet's answer to match hers, but he would take her hand each year when she said it, the same hand he had first taken on the porch steps all those years ago, and he would tell her, simply, that whatever the shape of it, forged or found, He thanked God every single day of his life that he had ridden into Cedar Hollow looking for ranch work, and found, instead, the truth of his family's death and the whole remaining happiness of his life, both waiting for him in the same small, brave, extraordinary woman. They grew old together on that land, watching their children marry in turn, watching grandchildren run barefoot down to the spring in summers that seemed, to Walter, to echo backward across 30 years and more to a childhood he had once believed was lost to him entirely. And if there were nights still, even in his old age, when he woke from dreams of smoke and fire with his heart pounding, Ellen was always there beside him in the dark, her hand finding his without needing to be asked. Steady and warm and present, a living proof that the worst nights of a person's life do not have to be the last word on how that life turns out, that even out of the deepest grief, if a person is patient and brave and willing to forgive what the world so rarely makes easy to forgive, something whole and good and lasting can still be built, plank by plank, season by season, the same as any home worth having ever was.